Our scripture reading for today comes from Luke chapter 8, verses 22 to 39. One day he got into a boat with his disciples, and he said to them, "Let us go across to the other side of the lake." So they set out, and they sailed. As they sailed, he fell asleep. And a windstorm came down on the lake, and they were filling with water and were in danger. And they went and woke him, saying, "Master, Master, we are perishing." And he awoke and rebuked the wind and the raging waves, and they ceased, and there was a calm. And he said to them, "Where is your faith?" And they were afraid, and they marveled, saying to one another, "Who then is this, that he commands even winds and waters, and they obey him?" Then they sailed to the country of the Gerasenes, which is opposite Galilee. When Jesus had stepped out on land, there met him a man from the city who had demons. For a long time he had worn no clothes, and he had not lived in a house but among the tombs. When he saw Jesus, he cried out and fell down before him and said with a loud voice, "What have you to do with me, Jesus, Son of the Most High God? I beg you, do not torment me." For he had commanded the unclean spirit to come out of the man. For many a time it had seized him. He was kept under guard and bound with chains and shackles, but he would break the bonds and be driven by the demon into the desert. Jesus then asked him, "What is your name?" And he said, "Legion," for many demons had entered him. And they begged him not to command them to depart into the abyss. Now a large herd of pigs was feeding there on the hillside, and they begged him to let them enter these. So he gave them permission. Then the demons came out of the man and entered the pigs, and the herd rushed down the steep bank into the lake and drowned. When the herdsmen saw what had happened, they fled and told it in the city and in the country. Then people went out to see what had happened, and they came to Jesus and found the man from whom the demons had gone, sitting at the feet of Jesus, clothed and in his right mind, and they were afraid. And those who had seen it told them how the demon-possessed man had been healed. Then all the people of the surrounding country of the Gerasenes asked him to depart from them, for they were seized with great fear. So he got into the boat and returned. The man from whom the demons had gone begged that he might be with him, but Jesus sent him away, saying, "Return to your home and declare how much God has done for you." And he went away, proclaiming throughout the whole city how much Jesus had done for him. This is the word of God, and Pastor Wayne will now preach to us from God's word.
Perry, I broke the mic. Sorry. I was adjusting it and I just broke it. So, all right, good morning, everyone. So I'm going to use this one. So good morning, everyone. Glad you can join us as we continue our series in the Gospel of Luke. And so many of you, if you've been here for a little bit, you know what our theme is, right? Our theme is to follow me. And the idea of the series is pretty simple. Basically, we are looking at the book of Luke, and we're asking the question, what does it mean? What does it really mean for us to follow Jesus, right? And each week, we've been looking at two things, right? The first thing we've been looking at, what does the Bible, what does Jesus tell us about how we should live, right? In other words, what should we be doing if we're going to be following Jesus? But I think secondly, one of Luke's main goals as we go through the series is to show us who Jesus is. Right, they want to know who Jesus is. And in some ways, I think these two things are connected, right? Because hopefully the more we learn about who Jesus is, it will lead us to want to follow him more and more with our lives. And by the way, I want to plug our vision statement as often as I possibly can, just to kind of really ingrain it into each of our minds, right? Our vision statement is to love, build, and serve, right? And as I was thinking about it, this is kind of what the series is about in Luke as well, right? So we kind of start with love, right, which is loving God. And that's really the goal of our worship service this morning, right? That each one of us would grow in our love for God. But if you want to grow, you have to be in community, right? Which is why the second part of our vision statement is to build one another up, right? That we're in community to really build one another up, and this is done through our CGs and our fellowships. But this is where I think some of us might get stuck, right, in our faith journey, right? We maybe, go to service, we go to a small group, we go to a fellowship, but I think and really to grow, we have to then take our faith and apply it to some place into our lives, right? And this is why the last part of our vision statement is to serve, right? To serve whether it's our church community, our Chinatown community, or our world community through global missions, right? And so the idea here is that each Sunday morning, right, this is maybe only the first step, right, in each of our faith journeys, right? That each one of us will kind of move through this process of loving God, building one another up, but then also serving our various communities, right? And this is really the hope for the book of Luke, right? What does it look like to follow Jesus? And also, how do we grow in our love and affection for Jesus as Luke shows us who this person is? And so this morning, we really have two different narratives, right? We have Jesus calming the storm, and we have Jesus healing the man with many demons. By the way, his name is not Legion. Legion is just another word for a lot of people. And so, basically, he just said many, right? So his name is not actually Legion. It's just that there are many, many demons that have possessed this man before. And we really have these two narratives, right? Jesus calming the storm and this man with many demons. And, the interesting about preaching through the book of Luke at the speed in which we are doing is that, it kind of forces me to think, what is the relationship between these two passages? Because usually pastors would break this up into two different sermons, right? Like you have, the calming of the storm, and then you have the legions. But I don't want to be in Luke for 3 years, and you guys will be tired of it. I'll be tired of it, and so so we're going through it a little bit faster, and that has forced me to think about, okay, what is the relationship between these two passages, right? Why does Luke, why does Jesus kind of do this back to back, right? Calming the storm, and then healing the man with demons, and the key, I think, to understanding the theme between these two passages is to actually think about it geographically. So, if I can figure out how to get to the next slide. I'm full of technological difficulties today. All right, so this is the best picture that I could find. But if you notice in verse 22, right, the very first verse in our passage, it says, "One day he got into a boat with his disciples, and he said to them, 'Let's go across to the other side of the lake.'" Right? And so this is Jesus going to the other side of the lake. So if you look at this picture, this is the best picture I could find. Sorry if it's really small. But if you just mainly notice the orange, right, the orange arrow. So Jesus is currently in Capernaum. Right, and in Capernaum, Jesus says, "Hey, let's go to the other side of the lake, or the Sea of Galilee." And so if you follow the orange arrow, right, there's the storm at sea. That's approximate. They don't know exactly where it is, of course. But then they finally land on the eastern bank of the Sea of Galilee. And the interesting about this territory during that time is that the west side was mainly Jewish communities, and then the east side was mainly Greek communities, right? So that entire section off on the, on our right side or on the east side was not Jewish territory. This was basically all Gentile territory. So what's interesting is that as Jesus is jumping on a boat, going to the other side of the sea, this is, in some ways, you could even see this as like a little short-term mission trip, right? They're leaving Jewish, predominantly Jewish land, and they're going into a place that is predominantly Greek. But in both cases, right, both the calming of the sea and the healing of the man with the demon, I think the theme that connects them, right, is that Jesus is overcoming evil. Jesus is overcoming the chaos, and that he is bringing order. Right? And the key is that he is taking what is chaotic, he's taking what is evil, and he's bringing it to order and to calm. Right? And you see this in both narratives, right? The sea is made calm, and then the man is also made calm. Right? He's taking what is chaotic, he's taking what is evil, he's taking what is a mess and bringing it to order. And so, back then the sea, especially the sea, was seen as this like untamable thing. Right, the sea was seen as chaotic. It was the abyss. It was the unknown. The Bible talks about sea monsters like the Leviathan, and so actually that's why in Revelation it says that in heaven there's going to be no sea. And I don't know if that's supposed to be taken metaphorically or literally, but the idea is that the sea represents this evil, chaotic, untamable thing, and in heaven it's not going to be that way, right? Because in heaven there's peace and there is order. And so actually, if I could just show you, one thing related to this is that if you go all the way back to Genesis 1:1, Right, it says, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Right, and then it says in verse 2, the earth was without form and void, and darkness was over the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the waters. Right, and so you see at the very beginning, there's this like kind of darkness, chaoticness, and there's the sea. Right, there's a sea that God, the Spirit of God, is hovering over. And in the very next verse, what does God do? Right, God says, let there be light. Right, and so in the midst of the darkness, in the midst of the chaos, God says, let there be light. And then throughout the creation, right, God is putting things in order, right? The natural order is being created, out of the midst of this darkness and chaos, right? So you see that, back then the sea was just kind of this uncontrollable evil thing that's how people viewed the sea, and Jesus is bringing order to that. Right, and in the same way, you see this demon-possessed man, right, that nobody can have control over. And yet God also, just as he calms the sea, right, he also calms the life of this man, right, bringing peace and bringing order and bringing calm to his life. Right, and so I think that's really the overall theme that kind of connects our two passages, right, that out of the chaos of this world, that God can bring order, peace, and calm. I feel like, every generation has the battles that they have to fight. And maybe our generation issues are, I don't know if they're better or worse than previous generation issues. But, I think all of us kind of feel the struggle of this world that we are living in now, right? And that we can all we would like to have some calm and peace in our lives. I was reading Reddit this past week. I probably read too much Reddit, but I was reading Reddit this past week, and someone made a comment. He was saying something like, "In this next decade, I hope that future historians would find it of little significance." Right? It was kind of like his comment. And as far as like once in a lifetime events goes, I feel like we've had way too many once in a lifetime events, right, in the past couple of years. And so, like in the midst of this chaos, right, in the midst of the chaos of this world, or even in the midst of the chaos of your life, right, what does it look like for Jesus to give calm and peace? Right, what does it look like if your life feels super chaotic, right, if your life just feels super stressful? What does it look like for Jesus to give us this calm and peace in our lives? Right, so that's kind of the question that we want to look at as we look at these two narratives. So let's take a look at these a little bit closer. And kind of really dig into how Jesus gives us this calm and peace in the midst of the storm. So this is the first narrative, right? So in verse 22, it says, one day he got into a boat with his disciples, and he said to them, let's go across to the other side of the lake. So they set out. And as they sailed, he fell asleep. And a windstorm came down on the lake, and they were filling with water and were in danger. And they went and woke him, saying, Master, Master, we are perishing. So one of the interesting things about this passage is that Jesus is asleep. Right? Jesus is asleep. And there's actually two things that we can say about this. First, the fact that Jesus is asleep, I think, shows that he is human. In our statement of faith, we say that Jesus is fully God and fully man, right? And so Jesus is human in the sense that he is asleep, right? He's tired, right? He's done a lot of ministry, and he's tired, and so he actually needs to sleep, as all humans do. And, this is why when we say that Jesus understands how you feel, right, that Jesus can relate to every struggle that you face, right? When we say that, we don't say it as conceptually, God understands, right? We actually say it as, no, actually, literally, Jesus experienced every emotion that you feel as well, right? He's experienced hunger, he's experienced pain, he experienced hurt, he experienced loss, he experienced betrayal, he experienced all the various emotions of human life, right? We can say that Jesus actually understands because he, as a human, has experienced it himself, right? And so that's the first thing, right? The fact that Jesus sleeps just kind of shows his humanity. But secondly, in the context of this passage, it seems like the disciples aren't very comforted by the fact, right, that Jesus is sleeping, right? They're thinking, Jesus, like, how could you be sleeping during a time like this? Right? Don't you know that our lives are in danger? Right? Don't you know that we are perishing? They go to him and say, Master, Master, we're perishing. How could you be sleeping, at a time like this? It kind of makes me think that maybe this is how we might feel at times as well. Right? We might also say to Jesus, like, Jesus, I'm perishing. What are you doing? Right? Sometimes it also feels like Jesus is just sleeping. Like, Jesus, why don't you care? Right? About all the things that I am going through. Right? So in many ways, maybe we could relate to this as well. Like, in all the midst of this chaos, in all the midst of the storm, Jesus, why are you not doing something about it? Right? Sometimes just like the disciples, the storms in our life, right, can seem so big, right? Yet Jesus can seem so small in the midst of it. Right? And so, so we have this chaotic storm that's going on, and what is Jesus' response? Well, before I get into the next section, I think I have to point out that I'm not going to talk that much about the storms in our lives. And the reason why I'm not going to talk about that is because it's so easy to read this passage and just to conclude the fact that Jesus will calm the storms in your life. And that's tempting to preach, right? That's a really easy thing to preach, right? Like, Jesus will calm all the storms in your life. Now, and I actually don't think that's what this passage is about, right? That may be true or it may not be, right? But I don't think that we can conclude in this passage, right, that this is a promise that Jesus will calm all the storms in your life. Rather, what I think this passage is really trying to show us is why we can trust Jesus in the midst of our storms. Right? Because Jesus may not calm the storms. Storms in your life can last a really long time. And so this passage isn't a promise that it will end, even though it will one day end, when we're in glory. But really what this passage is about is why can we trust Jesus when we are in the midst of our storms? Right? And the reason why I say that is take a look at what it says next. Right? So this is verse 24. Right? It says, "And they went and woke him, saying, 'Master, Master, we are perishing.' And he awoke and rebuked the wind and the raging waves, and they ceased, and there was a calm. He said to them, 'Where is your faith?' And they were afraid, and they marveled, saying to one another, 'Who then is this, that he commands even winds and water, and they obey him?'" Right? Indeed, actually, the biggest question that this passage is trying to show us is, who then is this? Right? Who is this guy that even the winds and the waves can obey him? Right? And so what I think this passage is about is not actually about that Jesus will calm all the storms in your life. What I think this passage is about is that the only way that you will find peace and calm is when you realize that Jesus is even bigger than all the storms that are in your life. Right? And the reason why I say this is for a couple reasons. Right? So in verse 25, it says that they were afraid. Right? And that's a really interesting place to say they were afraid. And actually, if you look at this passage, the word afraid only occurs after the storm has been calmed. Right? It actually doesn't say, it's implied, but it doesn't say that disciples were afraid when the storm was raging. It actually says that they were afraid after it was calm. And you would be thinking, like, why are they afraid, right? Why shouldn't they be rejoicing? And I think the reason for that, right, is because at that moment, right, when the storm subsided and they got over the shock, they looked at Jesus, right, and they're like, "Who are you? Right? Who are you that you are even able to do this?" And at that moment, they were even more afraid, right, than they were when the storm was raging, right? Because in that moment, right, they realized that they were in the presence of someone who was even more terrifying, right? Someone who was even greater than the storm itself. Right? And so I think what we need to know, right, what we really need to know in the midst of our struggle, maybe it's that Jesus will one day calm the storm. I think that's helpful too. But I think what's really helpful in the midst of our struggle is to realize that Jesus is even greater, right, than anything that you might encounter or experience. Right? Because, in the midst of it, right, our problems can seem so big and Jesus so small. But yet this narrative is trying to show us that peace only comes, right, when you realize that Jesus is even greater and even more terrifying than any of the storms that we might face in our lives. Now, you also might be thinking, like you say, okay, that the disciples were only feeling this way because the storm was gone, right? Jesus actually calmed their storm, right? So the only reason why they're feeling, good about this and they're realizing who Jesus is because he actually calmed the storm, right? And so you're thinking, well, of course they had peace, right? They had peace because Jesus calmed the storm, right? But what about in our lives, right? What if Jesus doesn't actually calm the storm, right? What does that, how does Jesus, speak to us in that? And I think that, and the answer to that is that I think Jesus actually looks at the disciples and he actually expects them to have this peace even while the storms are raging. And the reason why I say that is because as soon as the storm is calm, right, he turns to them and says, "Where is your faith?" Right? He looks at his disciples and says, "Where is your faith?" right? And from that statement, I think what we can conclude is that Jesus actually expected them to not fear, even while the storm was raging. Right? He looks at them as like, where is your faith? Right? Why are you so scared? And I think in many ways, Jesus isn't just saying, where is your faith? But where is your faith in me? I think is what Jesus is really saying. Right? Because Jesus is saying, don't you know who I am? Right? Don't you know who you are in the boat with? Right? And so I think Jesus is saying, not just where is your faith, but where is your faith in me? Right? Because the disciples, they've seen Jesus heal. They've seen Jesus cast out demons. They've seen Jesus teach, resurrect someone from the dead. They've seen all this. Right? And so Jesus' question to them is, where is your faith in me? Right? Don't you know who I am? Don't you know who you're in the boat with? Right, so I think from this we can conclude that the reason why they are calm is not just because Jesus calmed the storm, but what we really need to know in the midst of our struggle, right? That Jesus is greater, Jesus is stronger and more terrifying than the storms that we are in. But even in the midst of it, right, Jesus can say to us, "Where is your faith? Trust in me. Don't you know who I am? Don't you know who you're in the boat with?" Right, and so I think as we take a look at our passage, right? Jesus is taking what is chaotic, right? Taking what is, really crazy and putting calm and narrative about it. And as we see from this first passage, right? It's really not about how Jesus can calm all the storms in your life, even though he can. But really, the question of this narrative, right? And the question for all of us is, do you know who Jesus is? Right, in the midst of your storm, do you know who Jesus is? Right, and so this is kind of our main idea, right? So if Jesus brings order out of chaos, right, the first thing that we see is that peace and calm will only come by realizing that Jesus is even greater than any of the storms that we might face in our lives. And so, that's one example, right? One example of how what is chaotic Jesus brings to order. So let's take a look at this second narrative. And the second narrative is a little bit longer, but once again, we're going to see, right, how Jesus brings order out of chaos. So let's take a look at the second narrative. So they got through the lake, they got across the lake, and now they're on the other side. And this is what it says in verse 26. Oh, I don't have this. Okay, so you're going to have to follow along in your Bibles or scripture journal. So verse 26, it says, "Then they sailed to the country of the Gerasenes, which is opposite Galilee. When Jesus had stepped out of the land, there met him a man from the city who had demons. For a long time he wore no clothes, and he had not lived in a house, but among the tombs." All right, so a couple things about this man. So, Jesus crosses the lake, they got through the storm, he's now on the other side, and a man comes up to him, and first thing is he has no clothes, right? So I think this is a picture of both his shame, right, but I think also his loss of identity, right? He was not welcome in the community that he was living in, right? But the second thing about this guy is that he wasn't living in a house, but he was actually living among the tombs, right? He was living in a cemetery. And I think this is also an important detail because Jesus is going into the place, right, where death dwells, right? He's going into, this whole setting is a cemetery, is a graveyard, right? And Jesus is walking into a place where death is dwelling, right? And he walks into his place where sin has won its greatest victory, right? And he shows that he has authority even in those places, right? And this actually kind of parallels the previous passage, right? Because both of these are about like kind of the abyss, right? Kind of about like death, right? Like the near-death experience that they just had in the sea, right? Is kind of like the abyss. It's kind of like chaotic. It's kind of like death. And then now that he's walking into a cemetery, which is kind of similar, right? It's also kind of like an abyss. It's kind of like death, right? The stink of death is everywhere within that section. And in both of these narratives, right, Jesus is actually facing some of our greatest fears, right? He's facing, a near-death experience, or he's facing this man who's living among the tombs, right? And Jesus is kind of staring down the greatest evils, right, and showing his authority in the midst of that. Now, I think when we walk into a cemetery today, I wonder if we, think the same thing. Right? I wonder, like, when we walk into a cemetery, right, do we think that this is the place where sin has won its greatest victory? Right? And in many ways, we probably don't think that, right? Because I think as a society, we've tried to tame death as much as possible, right? Actually, we don't even call them cemeteries anymore, right? We call them memorial parks. And it's not like I'm against the name. I think the name is perfectly fine. But in some ways, right, it's like we've kind of tamed death. We try to make it as palpable as possible. And, it kind of reminds me of this time when I was meeting up with this rabbi in Center City, and I went to meet her in her synagogue, and I walked into her like sanctuary kind of place, and it was kind of interesting because on the walls of her entire sanctuary were a bunch of names on little plaques, right? They were just everywhere, right? So I walk in, I'm like, hey, what's the story behind all these names on the walls? And she basically explained to me that these were all the previous members of their synagogue over the past 100+ years or so. All the previous members of their synagogue, had their name on a plaque on the wall in their sanctuary. And this was kind of a way of reminding them, right, of their past, reminding them of the people that used to worship there with them. And it was actually kind of cool because next to each name was a light, and they're not super technologically advanced. It wasn't like hooked up to this, computer system. And so I think the way it worked, I might be remembering this incorrectly, but I think the way it works is that if it was your birthday month, someone would actually go through the entire sanctuary and then turn the light bulb so that that light would come on during your birthday month, right? So when I walked in, there's just like a bunch of lights everywhere, and those are like basically the birthday months of all the previous, people in there. And I was talking to her about this, and I was like, I love that, right? I was like, this is a way of remembering that, it's not just us, right? That there was a lot of people that came before us. And in many ways, I think in our day and age, we kind of make death as palpable, as far away as possible, right? We don't want to remind ourselves of death, right, in every day. Well, I guess if you're in the medicine field or medical field, you see it every day. But, like a lot of us try to keep it as far away as possible. And, back in the day, they used to have like church graveyards, right? Back in the day, you used to have church cemeteries where every single day you walk into church and you would see, right, like the tombstones of the people that came before. And, I was saying to her, I was like, how would my church react if I said, hey, I think we should start a church graveyard, like, you think that'd be a good idea? Like, we should, I don't know, maybe I'll propose it and see how far it gets in leadership. But, but the idea is that, we've tried to push death as far away as possible. But, but in many ways, like every time we walk into a cemetery or every time we walk into a place, we should remind ourselves, right, that this is the place where death has won its ultimate victory, where sin has won its ultimate victory, right, which is death. And I think one of the great hopes that Jesus brings into the life of the Christian, right, is that even in the face of death, right, we continue to have great hope. Right? And so this is Jesus, right, doing his ministry in a place where death is dwelling. And, narratives such as this one show us the authority that Jesus has, right, even in a place where sin seems to have won. Right? And so in verse 28, right, when Jesus saw him, he cried out and fell down before him and said with a loud voice, "What have you to do with me, Jesus, Son of the Most High God? I beg you, do not torment me." For he had commanded the unclean spirit to come out of the man. For many a time it had seized him, and he was kept under guard and bound with chains and shackles, but he would break the bonds and be driven by the demons into the desert. And one of the interesting things about putting these two narratives together is that, the disciples in the boat, right, they ask, who is this? Right, it's interesting, right? The disciples in the boat, they're the ones that ask, who is this man, right? Who is this man? But then if you follow down the narrative, who provides the answer? Right, it's actually the demons that immediately provide the answer, right? It's the demons that say, I know who this is, right? This is Jesus, the Son of the Most High God. And I think what this shows us is that demons, they know exactly who Jesus is. Right? The demons even know the power and the authority that Jesus has. One of the key words in this entire passage is there's a lot of begging. Right? If you just read it through, like everyone is begging. Right? The demons are begging, the townspeople are begging. Right? Everyone is begging Jesus because they're scared of his authority. And see, the problem with the demons is not that they lack knowledge of God. Right? The problem with the demons is their unwillingness to actually worship God as the Most High God. Right? They know that he's the Son of the Most High God. But their problem is that they're unable to worship him as the Most High God. Right? And that's really the aim of everything that we do here as a church, right? It's worship. Right, the goal of the Sunday service is worship. Right, the goal of the worship service is worship. Right, the goal of every Bible study is worship. The goal of every quiet time is worship. Right, or as John Piper says, right, the reason why missions exist is because worship doesn't. Right, worship is really the end goal, the ultimate goal, right, of all the things that we do here. Right, and so this is what we see here as well. Right, the demons, right, they know who he is, but refuse to worship him. Right, then in verse 30, then Jesus then asked him, "What is your name?" And he said, "Legion, for many demons had entered him, and they begged him not to command them to depart into the abyss. Now a large herd of pigs was feeding there on the hillside, and they begged him to let them enter these. So he gave them permission. Then the demons came out of the man and entered the pigs, and the herd rushed down into the steep bank, into the lake, and drowned." Now, there's a lot of things I can say here, but actually, I wanted to take this passage and dispel two myths that when it comes to demons and the devil. Right, two myths that I think are like relatively popular beliefs. So, whenever you see a picture of the devil in modern days, right, what do you see? Right, you see a dude in red, right, dressed all red with horns and with claws, right? That's like your typical image of what the devil looks like. And the thing is that we actually don't believe that that's what the devil looked like. And actually, the people that drew that in the first place also did not believe that that's what the devil looked like, right? So during the medieval period, there were a lot of like paintings and sculptures that were made everywhere, right, of biblical narratives, right? The church is a whole other thing, but the church was the biggest patron. They were really rich, landowners or whatever. Anyway, but then they were commissioned a lot of works of art, and part of the reason for that is because back then the literacy rates was super low, right? A lot of people couldn't read, and so the only way that the church could teach people about the Bible was to do paintings, was to make sculptures, was to do these things. And so that when the people saw them, that is the way for them to learn these Bible stories, right? Because they couldn't read it for themselves. And so, for example, I just want to show you this, but we were in Barcelona recently, right? And, there's a really famous church there called the Sagrada Familia. And, outside of the church is just amazing. But if you look at all the things in the church, it's meant to teach people about Jesus. And so I found this, it's actually really hard to find a good picture of the church. But this is like one of the views of the church. And there's actually three different like sides to the church. So one is like the nativity facade, which is like all about Jesus' birth. Another picture is the passion facade, which is like Jesus' death. And the other side was the glory facade, which is all about like life after death. So this is the nativity facade. I don't know, it's really hard to see and find a good picture of it. But this is basically tells the story of Jesus. So like on the bottom left, you can see the three wise men with their three gifts. I know it's really hard to see. On the top, you actually see some angels up there, and in the middle, there's a baby Jesus. You're not gonna be able to see it from that. But you could just Google it. So, anyways, but this was, the reason why they made the church this way is so that people couldn't read, right? But they can learn about Jesus if they just walk around the church, right? All they do is walk around the church, and they can learn a lot about Jesus. And so, during that time, there was just so many, of these paintings and sculptures and all this being created. And one of the things that they believed about Satan, and this is, we believe this as well, is that one of the reasons why Satan fell is because of his pride. Right? It was because of his pride that Satan, who used to be an angel, fell down, right? Because of his pride. And so the whole idea of this devil in red with claws and all that, and so here's a picture, right? So this is an example of the devil pictured in medieval art. So the reason why he's pictured like this is because those painters wanted to poke at Satan's pride, right? It's like, oh, you are a very prideful man, so I'm going to make you look ridiculous, because if I make you look ridiculous, it's going to poke at your pride, right? So it's kind of like a caricature in a way, right? They were trying to, it was kind of a statement of, look at how ridiculous the devil looks, as a way of expressing, right, as a way of poking fun at the devil's pride, right? And so this is actually why, Satan in our common days is pictured with the devil as like in red and horns. But the thing is, like, the people back then who drew this didn't believe that's what the devil looked like either, right? It was simply a way for them to, get at his pride, right? So I think just the first myth I just want to dispel, in the sense that, right, when we think of devil, when we think of Satan, this is not, how we think of it either. The second myth, a little bit more related to our passage, is that, what's interesting is that, sometimes people sometimes people believe that Satan is in charge of hell. Right? Sometimes you hear that, right? Like God is in charge of heaven, Satan is in charge of hell, right? And that actually is not true, right? Satan is actually not in charge of hell, because if you notice, the demons are actually begging Jesus not to be thrown into the abyss, right? Which is another way of saying hell. And basically, the demons knew that they were free to roam right now, but one day they would be in the abyss, and which is another word for hell. And in Matthew 8, in the same passage, right, he adds this detail, like, have you come to torment us before the time? Right? In other words, the demons knew that their time was limited. There was a time when they would also enter into the abyss, right? And so the idea is that we shouldn't think that, oh, Satan is just in charge of hell, but rather he is just going to suffer, if not more, than everybody else. Right? He's going to be in just as much, if not more, torment than everybody else while there. Right? And so just want to spend a little bit of time just to dispel that before we move on to the next part. Right? So just two kind of myths that I often hear about Satan or the devil that I just wanted to dispel for you. So let's pick it up in verse 34. Right? Kind of see what happens next. So in verse 34. It says, when the herdsmen saw what had happened, they fled and told it in the city and in the country. Then people went out to see what had happened, and they came to Jesus and found the man for whom the demons have gone, sitting at the feet of Jesus, clothed and in his right mind, and they were afraid. And those who had seen it told them how the demon-possessed man had been healed, and then all the people of the surrounding country of the Gerasenes asked him to depart from them, for they were seized with great fear. And just as a quick note, right, a lot has been said about the pigs that that the demons kind of enter in. I think that kind of shows us, a couple things. One is that, demons are always, they don't like floating around, right? They always like to be influencing something. Some people actually believe that when the pigs went into the abyss, right, because the pigs went into the sea, into the lake, which is the abyss, that kind of signals judgment, which means that maybe God, preemptively judged those demons and put them into the abyss. And again, we don't quite sure. But a lot has also been made about the fact that this was a huge economic loss for the people, right? And Mark actually tells us that this herd of pigs was 2,000. There were 2,000 pigs in this herd of pigs, which just kind of shows you the demon that was possessing this guy, that he can send 2,000 pigs. But a lot has been made also about like the economic loss that the people would have felt by losing their lifeblood, right, or their living, right, herding these pigs. But what's interesting, as we look at this, is that like people aren't actually afraid because they lost the pigs, right? The reason why the people want Jesus to leave, right, is not because they lost, all their pigs. The reason why they wanted him to leave was actually because of what Jesus did to this demon-possessed man, right? It says in verse 30, end of verse 35, it says, then they were afraid. Right, in verse 36, and those who had seen it told them how the demon-possessed man has been healed. Right, and so what really makes them afraid, right, is actually not the loss of their pigs, but actually at what's happened to this demon-possessed man. Right, and if you think about it, this man would have been known by everybody. Right, I can imagine, parents, telling their kids, right, okay, go out and play, but hey, stay away from the tombs because that crazy guy's there, right, and don't go over there, right? This man everybody would have known this man in the community, right? And I can even imagine, this is me, just imagining, or thinking, maybe this man was used to be part of their community, right? Maybe this man was like someone that they knew, just like there's someone's aunt or uncle or child that was growing up, and then whatever happened in his life caused him to be in the state that he's in, right? And so I think it's a small community, right? So everyone would have known this man. But once again, just like the storm, right? The people are not actually afraid. It's not the storm that caused people to be most afraid. Right? It's not the pigs that caused people most afraid. What caused people to be the most afraid was what Jesus did, right? It's actually Jesus himself that caused the people to be most afraid, right? And one commentator writes that they clearly prefer the presence of the demonic in their midst rather than the presence of a power that can drive it away, right? Or another way of saying is that they prefer to deal with the devil that they know, well, quite literally, and then to deal with Jesus, right, who has the power to restore this man back to normal life, right? And so, they reject Jesus. They say, Jesus, please go away. But, what I want to conclude with, and, just kind of want us to see as we, head towards the end, is that even though they rejected Jesus, right, the community rejected Jesus, Jesus still had a plan for them. right? Because let me just end with this little bit of application, because if you notice, it says that Jesus, this man, was sitting at the feet of Jesus. And what that means is that this man is now being discipled by Jesus, right? It reminds me of how, like, Mary, was sitting at Jesus' feet, right? This expression was probably literal, right? Because the teacher is probably standing there while everyone is, sitting. But it's also just an expression that means that they were willing and eager to learn from Jesus, right? So this man who Jesus healed, now Jesus is teaching him, discipling him. And Jesus had a plan for this man, right? Because this man who's just been saved by Jesus is like, Jesus, let me follow you, right? Let me be your disciple. Let me follow you around. But instead, Jesus had a better plan for this guy, right? And so let's take a look at this. The last thing we'll look at. So in verse 38, it says, the man whom the demons had gone begged, right? Again, lots of begging, that he might be with him, with Jesus. But Jesus sent him away, saying, return to your home and declare how much God has done for you. And he went away, proclaiming throughout the whole city how much Jesus had done for him. I believe that the reason why Jesus crossed the lake, it's kind of the start of a bad joke, right? Why did Jesus cross the lake? But I think the reason why Jesus crossed the lake is because of this man, right? I think Jesus specifically had this man in mind. He says, I'm going to cross the lake because I need to go see this man, right? And Jesus says to this man, right, I'm going to leave this city in your hands, right? The community wants Jesus to be gone, right? And so Jesus willingly leaves. But he says, I'm going to leave the community in your hands. And all I want you to do is go around the city, for the rest of your life, just go around the city and tell people how much I have done for you. And in many ways, this man becomes maybe one of the first missionaries to the Gentiles. Right, one of the first missionaries to the Gentiles. Jesus says, I know you want to come with me, right? But I have discipled you, I have taught you, I've taught you all you need to know, and I have a greater plan for you. Right? Go and tell the whole city what I have done for you. Right, and really, I think this is what God calls us to do. Right, whether you are, serving in Pump right now, whether you, are about to go off on a mission trip, whether, you're just going about your normal daily life. Right, I think what Jesus has called us to do is that he sends us into the world. Right, and he says all that we need to do is to tell other people about what Jesus has done for us. Right, and the thing is that, it's not our job to save anyone, right? We don't need to convert anyone. Jesus simply says, go, tell others what I have done for you. Right, and sometimes, we might not feel qualified, right? I don't know. I don't feel like I can, really tell people, what Jesus has done. But in many ways, if you look at this guy, right, he was probably the least qualified person, right, to share about what Jesus has done in his life. Right, he's probably the last person you would choose as the missionary to the city. Right, but yet God was happy to use his story and his life to bring people to himself. And, if I could just be super practical, for a second, one of the things that I found really helpful in my, talking with people is that, I actually use the phrase, well, as a person of faith, this is how I feel. I actually say that quite a bit because, sometimes I'm a little hesitant. Maybe you're a little hesitant. You don't want to be, too pushy, with your faith, or you don't want to be, shoving, Jesus into their face. And so a lot of times, it's not like when I'm talking to my neighbor, I'll just be like, well, as a person of faith, I'm not as worried about the future, right? Or I'll say well, as a person of faith, I know that things will turn out okay. And it's kind of like my way of, trying not to be super pushy, but also inviting them, if they want to, right, to have a deeper conversation about God, right? To just simply to tell others, right? All we're doing, right, is to tell others what God has done for you, what God has done in your life, the peace and the calm, the comfort, the whatever it is, right, what God has done for you. Right, and so in these two narratives, out of the chaos, right, Jesus brings calm into our lives. And with this craziness of this world that we live in, right, my exhortation to you this morning, right, is first to know and experience the peace and love of Christ in your life. And second is to go and tell someone, right, of what Jesus has done for you. Right, because this is a message I think that the world desperately needs to hear in a moment that we are in right now. Let's close in prayer together. God, we thank you because of what you have done for us. Father, we thank you that you have saved us, that you have taken us up out of the miry bog and the miry pit and set our feet on solid ground. And Father, for many of us, it might take some work to really be able to articulate the things that you have done for us, It might take time for us to, really experience the peace that comes from you and then be able to share that with others. But Father, I pray that in the journey that we are on, we see from this man that whoever we are, whatever our backgrounds, whatever we have done, that Father, you continue to use our broken lives, our crooked sticks, to draw straight lines. Right? You continue to take what is broken within us and to make us whole, so that we can then tell others about what you have done for us. And Father, I pray that for all of us, that as we are in a church in the city, Father, that we really would know how to be a light to all those around us. Father, that we would simply, from our experience, from our just experience of your love in our lives, that you would give us this eagerness and this passion to tell others what you have done for us. And so, Father, we thank you, we love you, and pray that, that as we sing the song response and as we continue to worship on Sunday, that you would grow our love and affection for you, and that you would cause a want and a desire within us to follow you in all the ways that you will lead us in our lives. It's in the precious name of our Lord Jesus Christ that I pray. Amen.